Hi, I'm retired NYPD Detective Vic Ferrari, and welcome to NYPD Through the Looking Glass podcast, where you'll get unique insight into the New York City Police Department. Before we get started, I encourage you to check out my Amazon author page, where you'll find my series of behind-the-scenes NYPD books. They're $10 paperback, $2.99 ebook download, including NYPD Presumption and Dysfunction. Hope everyone's having a good week. It's cold down here in Florida. I know those of you up north don't want to hear it, but that's why I moved down here. And as you can see, I'm wearing I get to wear this maybe 2-3 times a year, my Oakland Raiders heavy-duty sweatshirt that I bought at the Danbury Mall in '94. Got a couple of really interesting stories this week. I'm going to have an organized crime guest next week if all goes well with scheduling. But before we get to the story, let's go to the true crime section. An NYPD lieutenant with 19 years on the job was arrested early Wednesday for allegedly falsifying overtime records and stealing money worth more than $64,000 from the department over the course of several months, according to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Yeah, now they want to hunt crime. Thomas Fabrizi, 43 years old, was taken into custody in Lower Manhattan and charged with grand larceny, defrauding the government, and 8 counts of falsifying business records, the NYPD said. Prosecutors said Fabrizi, a lieutenant detective commander in the NYPD's major case squad, submitted overtime slips for work he never did, including overtime hours for when he was driving from Manhattan to his home in Rockland County and for time he spent at work. So we've covered this before, that it was the people that worked in the chief of the department's office, I think, that were, robbing the store blind, and they were working 70 hours overtime a week for a year. This guy is It's a lieutenant detective commander, and he's working a major case. So this guy's working. I'm sure this guy does a lot of work. Probably what they got him for, now they're saying $64,000. If he was doing his job, was he maybe stealing overtime? I don't know, maybe. But what's telling to me is they said they got him for logging out. So say for argument's sake, he worked till 9 o'clock at night. He worked till 6, and he worked 3 hours overtime, and maybe he left at 8, drove up to Rockland County, which probably takes an hour, and then told one of his guys to sign him out, which that's going to open up another can of worms, because the guys that worked under him, if they were signing him out or signing him in, or they're going to have a problem too, because like I said, they don't come in with a scalpel for these things. They tend to throw a hand grenade in. I'm sure this guy was breaking his ass. He got a little sloppy. If he stole $64,000 worth of overtime and they can prove it, he's done. I kind of think that now they're starting to point the finger at other people in the department, but I would really, unlike the others that they work in an administrative position, this guy's working on major cases. He's overseeing detectives that are working on cases across the city, sometimes out of city jurisdiction. I kind of want to reserve the right to see what's going on with this one. Staten Island drivers are putting their pedals to the metal, tying bunches of fake flowers over local speed cameras to keep them from working. More than a dozen bunches of bogus buds have been yanked down from devices throughout the borough in recent weeks, and the City Department of Transportation has recruited the NYPD for help to find the perpetrators behind the blossoming road hack. Speed kills. Tampering with speed cameras is unacceptable and puts the lives at risk, a DOT rep told the Post. That's total bullshit. We are actively working with the NYPD and the perpetrators, who will be held accountable for jeopardizing public safety. This is a crock, and it's unconstitutional. Speed cameras, red light cameras, because here's the thing. You have the right in this country to face your accuser. So if a cop locks you up and you have your day in court, you have the right to face him and have either yourself or your defense attorney to question what happened. With this, there's a photo or there's some kind of printout that you were doing X amount of miles per hour. How often are these things calibrated? And the reality is these things are a cash cow revenue machine for New York City and other municipalities. It's not just New York. What I find ridiculous is the city says, well, it saves lives. No, it doesn't. Because people will slam at red light cameras, at least. I know, you know how many accidents that I saw as a result of red light cameras? Because people like, oh shit, I got a red light here before, and they slam on the brakes and bam, they get hit in the back because the person in back of them doesn't realize there's a red light camera. I'm hoping they just get rid of these things because it's unconstitutional as far as I'm concerned. And the city's just doing it to make money. They're not trying to save lives. If they're trying to save lives, they would prosecute, they would get on these district attorneys to prosecute and hold these people accountable and get rid of bail reform. Story number 3, a ghoulish Alabama mortuary worker was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for hawking body parts to a sicko collector covered in face tattoos and piercings. And you got to see this guy. Candace Chapman Scott, 3 names, 37 years old, sold human remains from the University of Arkansas Medical Science Anatomical gift program to Jeremy Lee Pauley, also 3 names, a heavily pierced Pennsylvania man she met on a Facebook group that openly discussed the sale of body parts, according to Jonathan D. Ross, United States Attorney of the Eastern District of Arkansas. At her sentencing on Thursday, Judge Brian S. Miller called her crimes some of the worst I've ever seen and sentenced Ross of Little Rock for transporting stolen body parts out of the state. Yeah, and that's a crime to move them from the state, right? And conspiracy to commit mail fraud. The Arkansas Democratic Gazette reported. FYI, a crime is a crime, but if you use the mail, it becomes federal, and they'll get you for mail fraud, and you'll do time for that, and that's probably why the feds stepped in. Go to NewYorkPost.com and look up the story and look at what the 2 of these people look like and how they found each other. What I find fascinating is Facebook was running around censoring political groups and just wiping out groups and censoring people, but yet there's a Facebook group that openly discusses the sale of body parts, and Facebook was good with it. Story number 4, a New York City woman accused of killing a building superintendent used a pipe and tried to dismember the lifeless victim before stashing his body under a bed. Sandra Coto Navarro, 3 names, 48 years old, was charged with second-degree murder in the deadly attack of 55-year-old Jose Portillo, who was trying to collect $24,000 in unpaid rent from the woman and her husband, cops and prosecutors said. Coto Navarro, who was home alone in the Kew Gardens unit when she allegedly carried out the murder, used a pipe in the slings and claimed that it wouldn't be an issue because her fingerprints wouldn't be on it, according to cops and a criminal complaint. This chick must have watched one too many episodes of CSI Puerto Rico. I guess they never heard of DNA evidence over there. That's another thing you should look up. Look at the look on this woman's face. She's charged with murder, and she's coming out of the precinct like she got locked up for shoplifting. There's some sick people in New York. This story I got a kick out of. An off-duty New York City firefighter who once bragged that it took 7 cops to arrest him during a 2011 street party was busted again Sunday and charged with driving while intoxicated, police said. Jean Negron de Villa, 3 names, was taken into custody around 4:18 a.m. on Staten Island where he refused to take a breathalyzer test, officials said. Negron de Villa is listed as a firefighter in Brooklyn's Engine 279 and was charged with DWI, driving while his ability was impaired, and refusing to take the breathalyzer. I wonder what's going to happen to this guy. I know with NYPD, if you get locked up for something, for DUI, I mean, in my time, they would send you to the farm and alcohol rehabilitation clinic. I don't know what they do with the fire department, but it seems like this guy is no stranger to danger. This is at least his second arrest. So I got a couple of stories this week. It kind of revolves around, the first, I don't know how they're connected, but we'll just go with it. So early in my career, I worked in this unit, and I was assigned to work with a guy who was probably about 8 or 10 years older than me, and he had 4 or 5 years more on the job for me, which that's huge when you're basically a rookie. And I liked the guy. He was very mentoring. Whenever I needed a hand with something, he was funny. Used to meet with him, every now and then for a drink after work. He was married. He had a couple of kids. He lived in upstate New York, and I liked him. But the thing was, there was a bar near the precinct that he would always meet up with a couple of the day tour guys in my precinct. And these guys, they were dead wood. I mean, they were in the bar 5 minutes after their tour had ended. And, they would do more work to get out of work, if that makes any sense. And I always kind of wondered what the connection was with him because he was a go-getter. He liked to work. He made arrests and, he was a solid guy. The other guys, I don't know. I didn't have much use for them. So it's around the holiday. I worked with him probably about 7-8 months, and around the holidays. It was just before Christmas, and back then, before direct deposit, a lot of times Guys would cash their check in the precinct because the banks closed at 4, and if you were doing it 8 to 4, guys would go to a check cashing place and cash their check. Or if their bank was in the precinct, they would go to their bank. But back then, it was nothing for a guy to cash his check and walk around with $1,000, $1,500 cash and bring it home to the wife and family, and then they would deposit it in the bank or whatever, or if you had to spend. Anyway, it was the holidays, and he cashed his check, and he went up to, he said he went up to Westchester County Shopping Center, which for those of you that are in the 5 boroughs in New York City, you just get on the Deegan. It's like 2 or 3 exits up in Yonkers. I don't know what's there now, but there used to be a Gimbals, also just shirts. There was a ton of stores. Wanamaker's, I think, was there. A bunch of stores. Actually, I got a funny story about that. Let me just back up. When I was a little boy, my parents took my brother Fredo and I there, and it was the holidays, just like this story. And we were coming out of one of the stores, and they were selling, I don't know why, but there was a guy selling Italian ices in December. My brother's like 5 or 6 years old, and he goes, "I want an ice." And my mother's like, "Fredo, we're going home. We're going to have dinner, and I don't want you eating ice in December." And he's like, "I want an ice." She told him no 2, 3 times. And I'll never forget this. I got the photo somewhere. They had just gotten him a Parker coat, a little Parker coat. So I was like 7. Fredo was 5. My brother is pissed that my parents didn't get him this ice at the Westchester County Shopping Center. He reaches into his pockets, and I see him working it. The next thing I know, we get out to the parking lot. My dad's opening the car to the door. My brother starts pulling the stuffing out of his pockets. Like he just dug in there like a squirrel and ripped the stuffing out of his pocket. So my parents turned around and beat the shit out of him in the parking lot, and he got punished when he got home. So anyway, my partner goes to the Westchester County Shopping Center, and he says we're going Christmas shopping. The following day, he comes into work on Friday, and he's got his head down, and I noticed there was something wrong, and I was like, "Dude, let's say his name was Rob." I go, "Rob, what's wrong?" He goes, "Oh, Vic, you have no idea. My Christmas is ruined." And I go, "Well, what happened?" And he said, "Last night," he goes, "I went to the Westchester County Shopping Center. I went into Gimbals to buy a gift." And he says, "I reach into my pocket and my wallet's gone." I said, "You got to be kidding me." I says, "Where do you think you left it?" He goes, "Someone bumped into me when I was walking around there." He goes, "I'm 99% sure I got my pocket picked." And I says, "Well, how much did you have in your wallet?" And he goes, "My whole check." I'm like, "Oh Jesus!" So it was over $1,000. I think it was close to $1,500. And I felt awful, you know. I mean, I was like 25, he was like 33. I'm young and single. He's got a wife and kids. So I went to my sergeant and another guy. We all worked together, and I said, "Rob got his pocket picked." He goes, "I know." And I says, "You think maybe we should, we'll kick in a third each and float him alone?" I said, "Yeah, we could do that." So I had $500, and the 2 other guys had $500 apiece, and we went up to him and we said, "Listen, here, pay us when you can." And he goes, "I can't believe this. Thank you so much." He goes, I promise you I'll pay it." And I said, "Rob, I know you're good for it." He goes, No. He goes, "Give it," he goes, before March. He goes, he says, "I got a mortgage and stuff." I said, No, pay us when you can, right? So I didn't need the money, and I was young and stupid, and every now and then my sergeant, because I worked with him, my sergeant would say to me, "Has Rob brought up anything about the money?" And I'd say, "No, I really don't want to ask because I'm the new guy here." And my sergeant's like, all right, well, if he brings it up, let me know. So anyway, December turns into June, and my partner gets promoted sergeant. Okay. And, everyone's congratulating him and everything. And, happy, we're all happy for you and everything. And I think the sergeant brought it up and said, "Hey, Rob." And he goes, "Oh, my God, I totally forgot about it. My life has been crazy. Don't worry. When you become a sergeant, they have this thing. Before you go to the precinct, they have this. It's like a sergeant school. I think it's called BMOC. I wasn't a sergeant, so I might be wrong, but I think it's called BMOC. He goes, "I'll pay you guys before I'm done with BMOC. Don't worry about it. I'm not going anywhere." I'm like, "Okay." And he goes off and he does BMOC, and I think he wound up in a Manhattan North. He was in Manhattan. I know he wound up in a Manhattan precinct. "Has he said anything to you about the money?" I'm like, "No," right? And I'm not going to call him. So I go to narcotics division a couple of months after that. I'm in the narcotics division for about 1.5 years. I hate it. I go back to the precinct, and I'm back in the Bronx. But the problem is a lot of my Manhattan cases are now going to trial. And this is like almost like 2 years now after we lent him the money. So one day I was taking the train back from court in Manhattan uptown to the Bronx, and he's in his sergeant uniform and he's on the train. And he looked at me and I looked at him and I go, "Hey, what's going on?" And he goes, "Hey, how's it going? Blah, 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 blah." And I says, "Everything all right with you?" And he goes, "Listen," he goes, "I know I haven't paid you." Now, this is going on 2 years. He goes, "I know I haven't paid you guys back yet." He says, "But I'm getting the money together. I'm going to pay." And I go, "Well, Rob," I says, "it is kind of going on 2 years." He goes, No, don't. I'm good for it, blah, 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 blah. I said, "All right." So I go back up to the precinct, and those guys are still working there. And I tell them I run into him. And while the three of us are talking about it, there's another guy in the precinct that goes, "Yeah," he says, he sold his house. He sold his house. He sold his house. Like, that's kind of unheard of NYPD guys. They move upstate. They're going to stay there unless they get a better deal or something. I go, he sold his house and he's living in the Bronx with his family. Like, he moved his family, his wife and kids, and I think he was living with his father or his mother in their house in the Bronx. I said, "What, are you kidding me?" And they go, I don't know. I think he kind of ran into some kind of trouble or something. So my sergeant starts doing this investigation. And he finds out, remember I brought up that he used to hang out with these day tour guys. Well, they like to gamble. And apparently they like to gamble too much. And from what I was told, he got in over his head. And this is before FanDuel or DraftKings. Well, who are you going to gamble with? Your friendly neighborhood bookie. Your friendly neighborhood bookie is affiliated with your friendly neighborhood mafia. So when you fall behind in payments, you put your house up for sale, and this is what I was told. Anyway, so I says, well, that's the end of that. It's obvious he's ducking us, and B, he's got financial issues. So the three of us just wrote it off as a loss. It's like, we're not going to call him anymore. We really don't want to have anything to do with him anymore, but it's a loss. So I didn't run into him for like 15 years. Probably longer. And just after I retired, the precinct had a retirement party for this lieutenant who, I could do a story on him. He retired. Guy put in like close to 40 years on the job. So they had a retirement party. So there were people that had worked in this precinct for decades. So I had just retired. I heard about it. So I went up there. And it was great. It was running into people I hadn't seen and stuff. And who was there but Rob? And he looks at me and he goes, "Hey, Vic." And I said, "Hi, Rob." And he says, "I know you're disappointed in me." And I didn't say anything. And he says, "Don't worry." And I says, "What are you going to tell me, Rob? That you're going to get me the money?" I says, 15 years has passed. I says, "Obviously, you need it more than me. So we're good." No, I'll pay you back. And I'm like, "Rob, you could have given me $1 a day. You would have been paid off. You would have been paid off in a year and a half, 2 years." I says, "Don't worry about it." And then I heard that after his parents died, he moved someplace else with his wife's family. So I don't know. I mean, do I know that he was a degenerate gambler? No, I don't. I know he owed 3 guys $1,500 and ducked us and never brought it up, and that's what I heard. So it's kind of the end of a friendship, but you never really know somebody. People think they know people, but you really don't know somebody, which kind of pairs into the second story. So years later, I'm a detective, and I'm sitting across from this guy, and he was a couple of years old. He had less time on the job than me. He had like 6-7 years less on the job on me, but he was older than me, came on the job late. And I wouldn't say he was a secretive guy. I would say he would never reveal anything about himself. Like, it was like pulling teeth just to, make conversation with him sometimes about things. And the only really thing I ever got out of him that I believed was, we had a softball game one time, and the guy was in his mid-40s. I was in my late 30s. The guy almost, and I play softball my whole life, the guy almost blew my hand off. He had that kind of an arm. And I was like, wow, accurate, had a cannon. And then another time after work, we were throwing the football around, and he was throwing the ball 40, 50 yards. And I said, Jesus, where did you go to school? So he went to a Catholic high school powerhouse in the Bronx. And I said, Jesus, why didn't you go pro? And he goes, I was scouted. And I says, well, what did you used to throw on the radar gun? And he goes, low 90s. I said, really? He goes, yeah. I says, what happened? He goes, I got sidetracked. So I made a joke of it. I go, what are you, Roy Hobbs from The Natural? Like when Robert Redford gets shot by that chick, and then he goes back to the Major League Baseball, and everybody's like, what happened? I got sidetracked. And he just kind of laughed. He blew it off. So the thing with him is, you could never pin down where he lived. And that's kind of weird because the NYPD wants to know where its members live. So he would live with different relatives from different periods of time and never owned a house. To my knowledge, I don't even know if he rented. I think he just kind of lived with different relatives, which is odd for a 40-something-year-old guy, but whatever, that's his lifestyle, not mine. But what happens is, he's staying with his sister who lives in a housing project in Brooklyn or Queens, and there's no parking one night. So instead of leaving his car in the street, he goes into the housing project's parking lot with his car. And he doesn't want to get a ticket from a meter maid because you're supposed to have some kind of sticker in the window or on the bumper or whatever. And he throws his brightly colored NYPD parking plaque in the front window in hopes that a meter maid or another cop won't give him a ticket. So what winds up happening is someone who lives in the housing project can't find a parking spot. And oh, by the way, this guy doesn't have a sticker on his car, but he does have a brightly covered NYPD placard in the window. So John Q. Citizen, what he does is he writes down the license plate and the VIN number of the car, and he calls the Internal Affairs Bureau. So now the Internal Affairs Bureau is now looking into this. And I don't think the Internal Affairs Bureau really even wanted to do anything about it. They kind of kicked it back to our command. So one day our lieutenant, because I was sitting there, says to him, where do you live? And he goes, what? He goes, I just got a call from Internal Affairs, and they said you're part. He goes, oh, no, that. He says, I was just staying with my sister. She was having issues with her kids, and I stayed over a couple of nights. And my lieutenant said, okay. And when you work in organized crime, I mean, I know you got to do this in a precinct. When you work in organized crime, every year there's a survey, and you've got to fill out a ton of paperwork about yourself. And he says, your survey isn't up to date. He goes, where do you live? And he goes, well, I'm staying with my sister right now. And he goes, listen, you're going to have a permanent residence. He goes, Internal Affairs wants to have an address. He goes, Lieutenant, I'll have it to you in a couple of days. He says, all right. So my lieutenant forgets. Apparently Internal Affairs forgets, right? About 2-3 weeks later, Internal Affairs calls our office. And my lieutenant's like, oh, shit. So I'll never forget this. He comes out. He's got the phone cup. Let's just say this guy's name was Billy. He goes, hey, Billy. Yeah, Lou. He says, I got Internal Affairs on the phone. I need your address. And he looks up and he goes, can I get back to you on that? And the lieutenant just looked at him, walked away, and went inside. It's like, what is this guy doing? Like, what's the big secret? So what wound up happening is my lieutenant came up to me. He goes, this guy really, he goes, I know you made a joke of it. He says, but this guy really is Roy Hobbs. I don't know where he lives. So I think what wound up happening is he had to get an apartment and a permanent address, but it was the craziest thing because the guy was in the office with me about 8 years, and you never knew where he lived. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I wanted to go off script a little bit. I was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, whatever happened to this guy? I don't know if you guys remember in the late 70s. I'm in my late 50s, but in the late 70s, this guy started popping up at sporting events. They used to call him Rainbow Head. He had like a bushy, he was a white guy, but he had a bushy afro, and he would dye it rainbow colors. And he would get front row seats at the 1977 NBA Finals. I remember he was at the World Series one time. He would always be behind home plate, and he would hold up that sign with the scripture from the Bible, John 3.16. And then for a while there, he was going on with the glow sticks. I mean, the guy, I don't know where his money came from, but this guy was everywhere. And the sports announcers at first liked him. They used to call him Rainbow Head. Then the networks got on their ass, and then they like pretended that he wasn't there, even though he was there. And I think at the height of this guy's fame, he was on I think he was on a beer commercial and a soft drink commercial. He kind of marketed himself into sporting events. But as the 1980s ended, he started getting himself in trouble. And I said, what happened to this guy? Well, his problems started where he was jailed by the Moscow police at the Summer Olympics for making an ass out of himself. And then in the late 80s, he began a string of stink bomb attacks targeting Robert Schuller and Crystal Cathedral of the Orange County Register and the Trinity Broadcasting Network and a Christian bookstore. And then he had something going on with the American Music Awards to show that God thinks that they stink. So he starts going off the rails, lighting stink bombs off, messing with these people. But his undoing is, and this is a crazy story, it gets crazier. The guy's name was Roland Frederick Stewart, 3 names. Stewart was arrested in 1992 after a standoff in a Los Angeles hotel. He entered a vacant room with 2 men who he tried to recruit for a job. The men later fled the scene after he attempted to kidnap a surprise maid who locked herself in the bathroom. Reportedly, Stewart believed that the rapture was due in 6 days. During the standoff, he threatened to shoot airplanes taking off from nearby Los Angeles International Airport and covered hotel room windows with John 3.16 placards. What wound up happening is this guy they offered him 12 years. I mean, the guy's an EDP, disturbed person. I mean, should he have done what he done? Absolutely not. You can't try to kidnap maids and stuff, but obviously he's mentally ill, right? Like put him in place for the criminally insane. They offer him 12 years and he's nuts and he doesn't take it. So he rolls the dice and he got 3 life sentences. And the guy has come up for parole like 1,000,000 times. They won't grant it. And that's what happened to Rainbow Head. He got 3 life sentences for abducting a woman in an airport and stink bomb attacks and everything else. So if you're wondering what happened to him, that's what happened to him. So next week, I'm going to have a guest, hopefully, and he's been on the show before. He's quite entertaining. As always, I want to thank everyone for tuning in, especially my listeners in Denver, Colorado, Phoenix, Arizona, Columbus, Indiana, Clearfield, Utah, Bridgeport, Connecticut, home of the now defunct Bridgeport Highlight. I used to love that game, Highlight. Rod Sterling, Virginia, Newmarket, Ontario, and of course, my friends in the New York City's 5 boroughs. If you work in law enforcement and have an interesting criminal background, please drop me a note on Twitter or Instagram. If you're watching on YouTube, please ring the bell and hit the like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it. If you enjoy the content, please go to my Amazon author page. Just type in my name, Vic, Ferrari like the car, where you can preview all my NYPD books for free, including NYPD Presumption and Dysfunction. Stay warm, everybody. Stay safe, and I'll see you guys next week. Take care.